In the shadowed hollows of the Appalachian Mountains, where ridges fold into one another like a closed fist, and the truth is often the first thing buried, there are stories. They are not the pleasant tales told by a fireside, but rather grim whispers passed down through generations, heavy as the mountain fog. They speak of curses carried in the blood, of sins that fester in isolation, and of a justice so terrible it becomes a sin in itself. Among these legends, none is more unsettling than the tale of the Gentry triplets. The year was 1888 when they were born in a secluded corner of West Virginia known as Blackwood Creek, and their very arrival was an event that tore a wound in the fabric of the small, God-fearing community. They were said to be giants at birth, their size a horrifying omen, a physical manifestation of a spiritual sickness. But the true horror was not their birth. The true horror was the revenge that followed, a slow, meticulous, and biblical nightmare that the valley conspired to forget. The story might have vanished completely, lost to the kudzu and the silent judgment of the mountains, had it not been for the arrival, 15 years later, of a man who believed in answers, not omens. His name was Dr. Alastair Finch, a physician from Philadelphia, a man of science and reason in a land steeped in superstition. He came to Blackwood Creek in the autumn of 1903, a young man fleeing not a scandal, but the suffocating grief of a city that had taken his wife in a fever epidemic. He sought solace in duty, taking over the long vacant practice of a Dr. Abernathy, whose final letter had spoken of a community in desperate need, a place where a good man could still make a difference. The valley that greeted him was both beautiful and menacing. The mountains, ablaze with the colors of autumn, seemed to press in on the small collection of clapboard houses and muddy tracks, a constant, oppressive presence. The people were watchful, their greetings clipped, their eyes holding a deep, ancient suspicion of outsiders. Finch set up his small clinic in the dusty rooms above the general store, his modern medical instruments looking alien against the dark, time-worn wood. In his first weeks, he treated the usual ailments of a hard life. Infected wounds from logging accidents, consumption that rattled in the chests of the old, and the endless, wearying fatigue of the women. It was during these quiet, intimate moments that he first heard the name. Gentry. It was never spoken aloud, but rather exhaled in a whisper, a ghost of a word. When a child was born sickly, an old woman might mutter, "The gentry ta," when the crops failed. A farmer would stare at the blighted corn and spit, "Gentry luck." The name was a curse, a catch-all for the darkness that lurked at the edges of their lives. His questions were met with a wall of impenetrable silence. The postmaster would suddenly become very busy sorting mail. The blacksmith would find a sudden, urgent need to hammer a piece of glowing iron. The women would gather their children and hurry away, casting fearful glances over their shoulders. It was as if the word itself was a contagion they were terrified of catching. The only person who would speak of it at all was the town's reigning authority, Preacher Theron Hobbs. He was a tall, severe man with a hawk's nose and eyes that seemed to burn with a cold, righteous fire. When Finch, in a moment of frustration, asked him directly about the Gentry family, the preacher's face hardened into a mask of pious disapproval. He said, "Doctor, there are wounds that are best left unstirred. The Gentrys were a trial sent by the Lord to test this flock. Their story is one of sin and its inevitable, sorrowful conclusion. It is a matter for God, not for idle gossip or the morbid curiosity of an outsider." The threat was veiled but unmistakable. "You're not one of us. This is not your history. This is not your pain. Let lie." The warning only fueled the fire of Finch's methodical mind. A trial? A conclusion? These were not medical terms. They were evasions. He learned the Gentry farmstead still stood, 3 miles up the hollow, abandoned and decaying. The locals shunned the path that led there, making a wide berth as if the very soil were poisoned. For them, it was a place of ghosts. For Alastair Finch, it was the beginning of an investigation. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him, that this was no simple folk tale. In the heart of Blackwood Creek, a great and terrible crime lay buried, and the entire community stood as its silent, fearful tombstone. The question that began to haunt his waking hours was not what had happened, but why, after all these years, they were still so afraid. Dr. Finch was a man who trusted what he could see and touch, and the silence of Blackwood Creek was a palpable thing, a pressure against the ears, a weight upon the soul. Every closed door, every averted gaze, every half-finished sentence that died when he approached was a testament to a shared and deeply guarded secret. The community, bound together by blood, faith, and the isolating geography of the mountains, had closed ranks against him. They were a single organism, and he was the foreign body it was trying to expel. His most formidable obstacle remained Preacher Hobbs, whose influence was woven into the very soul of the valley. On Sundays, the preacher's voice would roll from the stark white church, a tide of fire and brimstone that washed over his congregation, cleansing them with fear and reinforcing the rigid moral code that held their world together. His sermons were masterpieces of veiled reference. He spoke of the serpent in the garden, the lure of forbidden knowledge, and the damnation that awaited those who sought to uncover what God had willed to be hidden. Though he never named Finch, every eye in the pews would subtly shift toward the doctor, sitting alone in the back row, a solitary figure of quiet defiance. The message was clear: curiosity was a sin, and the outsider was its vessel. Even the law was part of the conspiracy. Sheriff Brody Coulter, a man whose guts strained the buttons of his worn uniform, was more of a community caretaker than an officer of justice. When Finch approached him in his small, dusty office, the sheriff offered him a lukewarm cup of coffee and a piece of tired advice. He leaned back in his creaking chair, his expression one of weary resignation. "Doc, listen to me," he said, his voice a low rumble. "You're a good man. You've done more for my boy's lung fever than old Abernathy did in 10 years. But you're stirring a hornet's nest with a short stick. The Gentry affair, that's old business. Sad business. It ended the way it had to end." Finch pressed him. "What way was that, Sheriff? How did it end?" The sheriff sighed, the sound of a man defeated long ago. He looked out the window at the unpaved street, at the town he was sworn to protect. "It ended. That's all. Some things, Doctor, they don't have neat answers. They just have an ending. For the good of everyone, you need to accept that. The good of everyone." The phrase echoed in Finch's mind. It was the mantra of the valley, the justification for their collective amnesia. The good of the community had been deemed more important than the truth, more important than whatever justice had been denied. The oppression was not just psychological, it was environmental. The hollow itself felt complicit. Finch would stand on the small porch of his clinic in the evenings, watching the shadows of the mountains creep across the valley floor, swallowing the light. The air grew heavy, thick with the smell of damp earth and decaying leaves. The silence was broken only by the cry of a distant hawk or the rustle of some unseen thing in the undergrowth. It felt like a place that could keep a secret forever. He began to feel the paranoia of the town seeping into his own bones. He would catch himself looking over his shoulder on his walks. The friendly nods he received seemed tinged with menace, the small talk fraught with unspoken warnings. Was he imagining it? Or was he beginning to understand the suffocating power of a community united by fear? His frustration grew into a quiet resolve. If the living would not speak, perhaps the dead would. Or at least, the places they had left behind. He looked toward the dark cleft in the mountains where he knew the Gentry farm lay rotting. The path was overgrown, shunned for a decade and a half, but it was a path nonetheless. He knew that to walk it was to openly defy Preacher Hobbs, the sheriff, and the entire valley. It was to declare himself no longer a visitor, but an inquisitor. The decision was not made lightly. He was a doctor, a healer. His purpose was to mend, not to break. But he had come to believe that the silence in Blackwood Creek was not a scar, but a festering wound, poisoning the town from within. To heal the people, perhaps he first had to lance the boil of their past. One crisp morning, as the sun struggled to pierce the persistent mist, Alastair Finch packed a leather satchel with a lantern, some water, and a small pry bar. He told no one where he was going. He slipped out of the town unnoticed, a lone figure walking toward the one place on earth the people of Blackwood Creek were desperate to forget. The path to the Gentry farm was less a path than a memory. It fought him every step of the way, tangled with thorny vines and blocked by fallen trees that lay like the bones of forgotten leviathans. The air grew cooler, heavier, the sunlight struggling to penetrate the dense canopy of oak and pine. The woods were unnervingly silent. Not even birdsong broke the stillness. It was as if the fauna of the forest, like the people of the valley, knew to give this place a wide berth. After an hour of hard walking, he saw it. The farmstead did not emerge from the woods so much as it sagged into them. The house, a two-story clapboard structure, was a skeleton picked clean by time and neglect. Its roof bowed in the middle like a broken spine. Windows stared out like vacant eye sockets, and gray, weathered planks peeled away from the walls, revealing the dark rot beneath. A large, dilapidated barn stood nearby, its great doors hanging askew from rusted hinges, gaping open into a black maw. The entire scene was one of profound decay, a physical manifestation of the moral collapse Finch sensed in the valley. The place felt weighted down by more than just time. It felt heavy with sorrow and rage. He approached the house with caution, his boots crunching on a carpet of dead leaves and broken glass. The front porch groaned under his weight, and he tested each step before committing his full body. The front door was gone, leaving a dark, rectangular void. He lit his lantern, its steady, golden glow a small circle of reason in a vast expanse of darkness, and stepped inside. The interior was a wreck. Furniture lay overturned and broken, coated in a thick blanket of dust and cobwebs. A fine layer of mold crept up the walls, its tendrils tracing patterns like a dark, unholy tapestry. It was clear the place had been abandoned in a hurry, but also that it had been left to the slow violence of nature for a very long time. He moved through the downstairs rooms, the beam of his lantern cutting through the gloom. The kitchen was a scene of domestic ruin. A cast-iron stove was covered in rust, and shattered pottery littered the floor. In the main parlor, a large, stone fireplace stood cold and imposing, a gaping black mouth in the center of the room. Above it, a darker patch on the wall suggested a portrait had once hung there. It was in what he presumed was a child's room that he felt the first true chill. The room was small, its wallpaper peeling to reveal the raw slats beneath. In the corner, he found something that made him pause. It was a crude, wooden toy, a small carving of a bird. But what was unsettling was its size and weight. It was far too large and heavy for a child's hand, thick and clumsy, as if carved by someone with immense strength but little dexterity. It felt wrong, unnervingly out of proportion. He pocketed the strange object and continued his search, finding nothing else of note. He was about to leave, a sense of anticlimax mingling with his unease, when he heard sound. A faint scraping from outside. He froze, lantern held high, his heart pounding in his chest. He extinguished the light and moved silently to one of the broken windows, peering out into the gray afternoon. There, near the edge of the clearing, stood a figure. It was an old woman, bent and frail, dressed in dark, patched clothing. She was gathering herbs, her movements slow and deliberate. Finch recognized her. He had seen her on the periphery of the town, a solitary figure who never came to the market and never attended church. The children called her the Hollow Witch. Her name, he had learned, was Alara. As he watched, she straightened up, her back clearly aching, and her gaze fell upon the house. Her eyes, even from a distance, seemed to hold a profound and ancient sadness. She looked at the house not with fear, but with a kind of weary familiarity, as if it were a grave she was duty-bound to visit. Finch felt a sudden, intuitive certainty. She was the ally the silence had hidden from him. She was the one person in all of Blackwood Creek who was not merely afraid of the Gentry secret, but was a part of it. He stepped out of the house, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. The old woman startled, dropping her basket. Her eyes, when they met his, were wide with a terror that was not for herself, but for him. "You shouldn't be here," she rasped, her voice dry and cracked like old leaves. This place, it ain't for the living. My name is Dr. Finch, he said, his voice calm and steady. I need to understand what happened here. The people in the valley won't speak of it. But you know, don't you? Alara stared at him, her face a mask of conflict. Fear warred with a deeper emotion, something that looked like guilt. For a long moment, she said nothing, her gaze fixed on the rotting facade of the Gentry house. Then, with a slow, trembling hand, she pointed a gnarled finger toward the root cellar doors, almost completely hidden by overgrown weeds. The sin ain't in the walls of the house, doctor, she whispered, her voice barely audible. It's in the ground beneath it. But the beginning was in her. She looked from the cellar doors back to his face, a decision crystallizing in her haunted eyes. They're all afraid of the ending. But I was there for the beginning. I saw them come into this world. Alara did not invite him into her home, a small, isolated cabin tucked deeper into the woods, but rather met him at the edge of her property as if to keep the contamination of his questions from her hearth. She was a creature of thresholds and boundaries, and the Gentry story was a border she had not allowed anyone to cross for 15 years. She sat on a worn tree stump, her hands, gnarled as ancient roots, twisting a piece of cloth in her lap. Finch stood before her, not as a doctor to a patient, but as a supplicant. He knew that any hint of pressure, any sign of judgment, would send her retreating back into the shell of her silence. They call me a witch, she began, her voice a low, gravelly monotone, her eyes fixed on some point in the middle distance. Because I was the one who brought them into the light. The midwife. There was no one else. Sarah Gentry was too terrified to go into the valley, and no doctor would have come this far up the hollow then. She paused, her breath catching in her throat as the memory took hold. Jedediah Gentry fetched me himself. He came to my door in the dead of night, his face like a thundercloud. He wasn't a man who asked for help. He was a man who commanded it. Everyone in the valley respected Jedediah. He was a pillar of the community, a lay preacher who could quote scripture better than Hobbes himself. But there was a coldness in him, a cruelty behind the piety. Finch listened, not interrupting, letting the story pour out of her at its own pace. He could picture the scene, the frantic midnight ride, the lantern-lit cabin, the proud, angry man forced to seek help from the reclusive midwife he likely despised. The birthing was a nightmare, Alara continued, her voice dropping to a near whisper. Sarah, poor Sarah. She was a ghost already, a thin, terrified wisp of a girl, married to a man twice her age. Her eyes were just empty. She screamed for 2 days. It wasn't natural. Nothing about it was natural. Alara looked directly at Finch then, her gaze sharp and lucid, demanding he believe the impossible. When the first one came, I nearly fainted. He was huge, bigger than any newborn I had ever seen, his limbs thick, his head misshapen. I thought, my God, this is the only one, a monstrous birth. But there was another, and another. 3 of them, all boys, all giants, each one bigger and stranger than the last. A shudder racked her frail body. They didn't cry like normal babies. It was a low, rumbling sound, almost a growl. It was the sound of something ancient and angry being dragged into the world. Finch finally spoke, his voice gentle. The title of my video says they were inbred. Did you know of this? Alara flinched, as if the word itself was a physical blow. She nodded slowly. Whispers. Sarah was Jedediah's niece, his sister's girl. The old patriarch, Jedediah's father, arranged it. To keep the Gentry land, the Gentry blood, pure and contained within the family name. It was an old-world sin, dressed up in talk of inheritance and legacy. Jedediah used scripture to justify it, twisting the word of God to bless his own corruption. He saw Sarah not as a wife or as kin, but as property, a vessel to continue his line. She described the moment after the birth with chilling clarity. Jedediah Gentry had stood over the 3 unnaturally large infants, his face not one of fatherly pride, but of cold, calculating fury. He hadn't seen sons. He had seen a judgment. He pointed at them, Alara said, her voice trembling, and he declared them God's punishment for a sin he would not name. But it wasn't his sin he was talking about. It was Sarah's, the sin of her weakness, of her tainted womb. He gathered them up, one in each arm and the third cradled against his chest, and took them from the room. He turned to me, his eyes like chips of ice, and he said, "You will not speak of this. You will not speak of their size. You will say Sarah Gentry had a son. One son. The rest is between me and my God." The threat was absolute. In a community where Jedediah's word was second only to preacher Hobbes's, Alara knew that defiance meant ruin. She had held her tongue, but the guilt had festered for 15 years. "I failed her," Alara whispered, the words heavy with shame. "I failed those boys. I left them in the hands of a monster." Finch felt a surge of pity for the old woman. She was not a witch. She was a witness, cursed by a memory she could neither share nor forget. "It's not too late to tell the truth," he said softly. "You said the beginning was in her, in Sarah. What did you mean?" Alara looked up, a flicker of hope in her haunted eyes. Sarah was quiet, but she wasn't empty. She read. She wrote. She kept a journal. She told me once, in a moment of confidence before the birth, that it was the only place her soul was still her own. She said Jedediah would burn it if he ever found it. She kept it where the heart of the home is, but never warm. I never knew what she meant, but I think it must still be there, in that house. He wouldn't have thought to look for a woman's soul, where the heart of the home is, but never warm. The riddle hung in the air between them. Finch's mind raced. The fireplace, the cold, black heart of the home. He now had more than just a location. He had a map. He had a key. The journal of Sarah Gentry. It was the story within a story, the voice of the victim. And it was waiting for him in the ruins of that cursed house. The oppressive gray of the afternoon was yielding to the deep purple of twilight as Finch made his way back to the Gentry farm. This time, there was no hesitation in his step, only a grim sense of purpose. Alara's words, "Where the heart of the home is, but never warm," echoed in his mind, a key turning a lock he hadn't known existed. He re-entered the house, the beam of his lantern cutting a nervous path through the gathering dark. The silence inside was deeper now, more profound, as if the house were holding its breath, waiting. He went directly to the parlor, to the great stone fireplace that dominated the room. It was cold to the touch, its stones coated in a fine layer of soot and grime. The heart of the home, but never warm. He ran his hands over the rough-hewn mantelpiece, then down the stone columns on either side. He pressed and prodded, searching for a loose stone, a hidden catch, a secret compartment. For nearly an hour, he found nothing. Dust and cobwebs were his only reward. Frustration began to gnaw at him. Had Alara been wrong? Had Sarah's words been mere poetry, a metaphor with no physical meaning? He was about to give up when his fingers brushed against something in the deep shadow of the hearth itself, near the floor. It was a small, iron ring, almost completely obscured by soot, set into one of the fire bricks at the very back of the fireplace. It was not a part of the original construction. It was an addition. His heart hammered in his chest. With a grunt of effort, he pulled. The brick resisted, then scraped loose with a sound that was unnervingly loud in the dead quiet of the house. Behind it was a small, dark cavity, just large enough to hold a single object. Reaching inside, his fingers closed around a book. It was a simple ledger, bound in worn leather, its pages swollen and stained by years of dampness. He carried it over to a broken table, clearing a space with a sweep of his arm. He opened it with the care of a surgeon handling delicate tissue. The first page was dated April 1887. The handwriting was elegant, precise, a stark contrast to the ruin that surrounded him. It began, "My name is Sarah Gentry. I was Sarah Albright. I begin this record not for other eyes, for I pray no one ever reads of my shame, but to remind myself that the person who holds this pen still exists. I am 17 years of age, and I am married to my mother's brother, Jedediah. Today is my wedding day. The Lord have mercy on my soul." Finch sat down on an overturned crate, the lantern light casting long, dancing shadows on the walls around him. He began to read, and as he did, the voice of Sarah Gentry rose from the page, a ghostly whisper that filled the decaying house. He was no longer just a doctor in a ruined farmhouse. He was a conduit, a listener at the confessional of a long-dead woman. The early entries were a portrait of despair, painted with quiet, heartbreaking detail. She wrote of Jedediah's coldness, his suffocating piety. He was a man who used the Bible not as a source of comfort, but as a weapon of control. Her life was a litany of chores, prayers, and silent, lonely meals under his scrutinizing gaze. Jedediah speaks of our union as a holy duty, she wrote one night. He calls it a consolidation of God's bounty, keeping the land strong. He reads from the Old Testament of bloodlines and birthrights. But when he looks at me, I do not see a husband. I see a farmer inspecting his prize heifer. I'm not his wife. I am his broodmare, here to produce a gentry heir to inherit this land that has become my prison. The narrative took a darker turn as she chronicled the months leading up to the birth. She wrote of her growing terror, of the unnatural swelling of her body, the violent, constant movement within her. It does not feel like one life, she wrote, her handwriting becoming more frantic, more desperate. It feels like a litter, a nest of serpents writhing in my womb. Jedediah says it is a sign of God's magnificent favor that I am blessed with abundance. But at night, when he sleeps, I feel a deep and terrible certainty. This is not a blessing. This is a curse made flesh. Then came the entry from the day after the birth. The elegant script was gone, replaced by a jagged, almost illegible scrawl. He has taken them. Three sons. Monsters. I saw them for only a moment before he tore them from my arms. I heard Alara weep. Jedediah's face was like stone, like a cliff face in a storm. He said God has sent him a penance, and he will bear it. He will raise them not as sons, but as beasts of the field, to tame their corrupted nature through labor and the rod. He has named them Cain, Abel, Seth, a mockery of the holy book, a mockery of me. They are in the barn. I can hear them. They do not cry. They growl. Finch had to stop. He looked up from a journal, his own hands trembling. The house around him was no longer just a ruin. It was a stage. He could almost see the terrified young woman, hiding in the dark, scribbling these words by candlelight, her body aching from the traumatic birth, her mind reeling from the horror of what her husband had done. He was holding the prologue to the tragedy. The diary was the testimony of the first victim, Sarah, but it was also the origin story of the perpetrators. These are not just giant inbred triplets. They were children stolen at birth, denied a mother's love, and handed over to the care of a fanatic who saw them as living sins. The revenge that was to come, Finch realized, was not an act that had sprung from nowhere. It was a seed planted in the fertile soil of Jedediah's monstrous cruelty, and it had been watered daily with pain and humiliation. He read on, unable to stop, a man compelled to witness the full, terrible bloom of that poison tree. The flickering lantern light threw Alastair Finch's shadow, large and distorted, against the peeling wallpaper as he hunched over the leather-bound journal. The night had fully descended upon Blackwood Creek, and the Gentry farmstead was an island of faint light in an ocean of impenetrable darkness. The world outside the broken windows had ceased to exist. There was only the room, the book, and the haunting voice of Sarah Gentry. As he delved deeper into the journal, the narrative shifted from the initial shock of the birth to a grim chronicle of the years that followed. Sarah's entries became a meticulous, heartbreaking record of abuse, a catalog of cruelties inflicted upon the three boys she was forbidden to call her own. They are 5 years old, she wrote, but they're the size of boys twice their age. Jedediah works them from sunup to sundown. He calls it breaking them to the yoke. He says their unnatural strength is a gift from the devil, and it must be bent to God's will through toil. I watch them from the window as they haul rocks from the fields, their small bodies already thick with muscle, their faces perpetually grimed with dirt. They do not speak, not with words, but I see them look at one another. A flicker of the eyes, a slight turn of the head. It is a language all their own, a silent conversation in a world that has given them no voice. The journal detailed Jedediah's systematic campaign to dehumanize his sons. He refused to let them eat at the table, instead leaving their food in wooden bowls on the back porch, as one would for dogs. They slept in the barn, on beds of straw, even in the depths of winter. Their only education was Jedediah's twisted interpretation of Scripture, screamed at them during their brief rest from labor. He would read passages of damnation and wrath, telling them they were the physical embodiment of sin, their very existence an affront to the Almighty. Any infraction, any perceived laziness or defiance, was met with the brutal application of a thick leather strap. Cain is the defiant one, Sarah wrote. He has his father's eyes, full of cold fire. He takes the beatings without a sound, his gaze fixed on Jedediah the entire time. It is a look of such pure, undiluted hatred that it frightens me. Abel is the quietest, the most watchful. He seems to feel the pain of his brothers more than his own. When Cain is whipped, Abel's hands clench into fists until his knuckles are white. Seth is the largest and perhaps the slowest. He is a creature of immense physical power, but there is a deep sadness in him. He is the one who carved the wooden bird Finch found. He carves things constantly, animals, faces, as if trying to create a world more beautiful than the one he knows. Jedediah finds them and burns them. He calls them idols. The most damning passages, however, were those that implicated the wider community, and specifically Preacher Hobbs. Finch's breath caught as he read one particular entry from the boy's 10th year. Preacher Hobbs came to the farm today. Jedediah had requested his counsel. I hid in the upstairs hallway, listening at the vents. Jedediah spoke of the boy's unnatural growth and defiant spirits. He worried they were getting too strong to control. I held my breath, praying that this man of God would intervene, that he would see the horror of what was happening. I prayed he would tell Jedediah that these are his sons, not his slaves. Sarah's handwriting trembled with rage and disillusionment. But the preacher did not. He commended Jedediah on his fortitude. He called the boys Jedediah's cross to bear. He said, "The devil has given them the strength of oxen, so you must work them like oxen. Break their pride, brother Gentry. Keep this family's affliction hidden from the world, lest it cast a shadow on the faith of the flock. Your privacy is a shield. Use it." They prayed together after that. They prayed for Jedediah's strength to continue his holy work. Finch closed his eyes. The conspiracy of silence was not born of passive fear. It was architected. It was sanctified from the pulpit. Preacher Hobbs had not been a blind shepherd. He had been an accomplice, sacrificing 3 tormented children for the sake of his community's placid, manufactured piety. The journal revealed the cyclical nature of the family's trauma. Jedediah, himself a product of a tyrannical father who had forced him into an incestuous marriage, was now perpetuating an even more monstrous form of abuse on his own sons. He was not just punishing them for the sin he believed they represented. He was punishing them for being living, breathing reminders of his own. The final entries in the journal were frantic, filled with a sense of impending doom. The triplets were now teenagers, towering figures of startling size and strength, their silence having curdled from fear into a sullen, simmering rage. "They are 15 now," Sarah wrote, her last entry dated just a few weeks before Finch's arrival in the region. "They are giants. They move with a strange, coordinated grace, like a pack of wolves. Jedediah is an old man now, but his cruelty has not waned. If anything, it has grown sharper with fear. He knows he is losing control. Yesterday, he accused Abel of stealing an apple. He took the strap to him, but something was different. Cain and Seth stood on either side, watching. They did not intervene. They just watched. And for the first time, I saw fear in Jedediah's eyes. He saw it too. He was not whipping one boy. He was striking a 3-headed beast. Later, I saw them in the twilight near the woods. They were whispering to each other, their deep voices a low vibration I could feel in my chest. They were planning something. The air on this farm is thick with it. Something is about to break. God help us. God help Jedediah, for I do not think they will." The journal ended there. The page was blank. Finch sat in the suffocating silence. the book open in his hands. He had read the prophecy. He had witnessed the long, slow march toward retribution. The revenge was no longer a mystery. It was an inevitability. He now understood that the whispers in the valley were not just about a shocking birth. They were about a shocking reckoning. The question was no longer what the triplets had become, but what their creator had finally made them do. The journal lay open on the broken table, its last words a stark and chilling prophecy. Finch was left in the echoing silence of the farmhouse, holding the story of the crime, but not its resolution. The narrative had been severed at its most critical point, leaving him to stare into the abyss of what came in. Alastair Finch did not return to his clinic. The dawn was breaking as he walked back towards Blackwood Creek, not with the stealth of an investigator, but with the determined stride of an accuser. The journal was tucked securely inside his coat, its weight a constant reminder of the truth he now carried. The images from the cellar, the crude cage, the rusted manacle, the claw marks on the wood, were burned into his mind. He walked directly to the pristine white church that stood in the center of the valley, a symbol of the community's curated purity. He knew that on a weekday morning, Preacher Hobbs would be in his study, preparing his sermons, polishing the words he used to maintain his absolute control. Finch did not knock. He pushed the heavy oak door open and found the preacher seated at a large, dark wood desk, a Bible open before him. Hobbs looked up, his expression of serene contemplation instantly hardening into one of cold fury at the sight of Finch. His eyes, usually burning with righteous fire, were now like chips of FL Doctor. Hobbs said, his voice dangerously quiet, "You are trespassing in the house of the Lord. Your presence here is not welcome." Finch walked forward until he stood on the other side of the desk. He placed Sarah Gentry's journal on the polished wood between them. "I'm not here as a doctor. Preacher," Finch said, his own voice steady, devoid of the tremor he felt inside. "I am here because I have just come from the Gentry farm. I have read this, and I have been in the cellar." The preacher's composure fractured. For a split second, a flicker of raw, primal fear showed in his eyes before it was masked by a wave of indignation. He did not look at the journal. He knew what it was. "You have desecrated a place of sorrow," Hobbs hissed, rising to his feet, his tall frame seeming to fill the room. "You have dug up a grave for your own morbid satisfaction. You have no right." "I have every right," Finch countered, his voice rising to match the preacher's intensity. "The right of a man who will not stand by while a truth this monstrous is buried." You knew what Jedediah was doing to those boys. Sarah's journal says you told him to break their pride, to work them like oxen. You gave him your blessing to be a monster. Hobbs recoiled as if struck. "You twist the words of a grieving woman." "I counseled a man struggling with a terrible burden placed on him by God. I advised him to maintain the privacy and sanctity of his family. You call it privacy, I call it a conspiracy." Finch's voice echoed in the hallowed study. "You helped him build the walls of their prison. And when those boys finally broke, when they turned their father's cruelty back on him, you helped build a wall around that secret, too. You and Sheriff Coulter. You went to that farm. You saw the cage in the cellar. You saw what Jedediah had become. And you did nothing. You left him there." The preacher's face was pale, his knuckles white where he gripped the edge of his desk. The facade of the righteous man had crumbled, revealing the desperate politician beneath. He tried a different tactic, his voice shifting from anger to a tone of condescending reason. "And what would you have had us do, Doctor? What would justice have looked like? Arrest the Gentry boys? For what? For building a cage?" Jedediah was still alive. "Do we put them on trial and expose the family's sin, the incest, the abuse, to the world? Drag this entire community through a scandal that would have destroyed us? Taint every family with the shame of what happened in that house? Sometimes the law is a clumsy, brutal instrument. I chose mercy. I chose to contain the sickness, to let it burn itself out rather than let it spread. You chose silence." Finch shot back, his voice filled with the righteous indignation the style profile described. "You chose convenience over conscience. You condemned a man, no matter how vile, to an unspeakable fate, And you allowed 3 damaged souls to become the monsters their father always claimed they were. You didn't contain a sickness, preacher. You nurtured it in the dark. You sacrificed them all, Jedediah, Sarah, the boys, on the altar of this town's reputation. Hobbs stared at him, his chest heaving. For a long moment, there was only the sound of their ragged breathing. The preacher saw that his justifications, the arguments that had held this secret together for over a decade, were dissolving under the unwavering gaze of this outsider. His power had been absolute because it had never been truly challenged. Now, a man of science and reason was holding up a mirror to his soul, and the reflection was ugly. "You do not understand this place," Hobbs whispered, his final, desperate defense. "You do not understand the things we must do to survive, to hold ourselves together in these mountains. You come here with your city morality and your books, and you judge us. You have no idea of the cost." "I have read the cost," Finch said, tapping the journal with a single finger. "It is written here in blood and tears, and I have seen the price in a cage in a dark cellar. The only thing I don't understand is how a man of God can sleep at night, knowing what he has allowed to fester in the darkness, just a few miles from his pulpit." The confrontation was over. There was no victory, no confession. Hobbs did not break down. He simply stood there, defeated, his authority exposed as a hollow shell. Finch had not come for an apology. He had come to shatter the silence. And in the cold, dead air of that study, he had succeeded. He picked up the journal, a document far more sacred than any Bible in that room, and turned his back on the preacher. As he walked out of the church and into the morning light, he knew the secret of Blackwood Creek was no longer its own. It was his now, and he had one last witness to speak to, one last piece of the puzzle to find. The confrontation with Preacher Hobbs had left Finch feeling hollowed out, the righteous fire of his anger replaced by a cold, weary sadness. He had broken the silence, but the truth he had unearthed offered no comfort, no simple resolution. It was a tangled knot of pain, abuse, and vengeance, where victims had become perpetrators and protectors had been the worst kind of villains. The only person left to talk to was the one who had started him on this path, the one who existed on the fringes, the keeper of the beginning, and he now suspected the end. He found Alara sitting on her porch, as if she had been waiting for him. She looked at his face and seemed to understand immediately where he had been and what he had found. There was no surprise in her eyes, only a deep, abiding sorrow. "You know," she said, her voice a soft rustle of leaves. "It was not a question. I saw the cage," Finch said, his voice flat. "I read her journal. I confronted Hobbs." Alara nodded slowly, her gaze drifting towards the mountains that ringed the valley. "Hobbs and the sheriff. They went up there a week after it happened. After the silence started, the whole valley was holding its breath. They came back, their faces like stone. Hobbs gave a sermon the next Sunday about a divine quarantine, a sickness of the soul that had taken the gentry land, and that it was to be shunned for our own spiritual protection. He made fear a virtue. He made forgetting an act of faith. Finch sat on the steps of her cabin, the weight of the last 24 hours pressing down on him. "What happened to them, Alara? What happened in the end?" The old midwife was silent for a long time, gathering the final, ragged threads of the story. "Sarah died first," she said softly, "about 5 years after they built the cage. Her heart just gave out. She was a ghost for years, living in that house with the sound of her husband's damnation rising up from the floorboards. I don't know if her death was a release or a final surrender. No one from the valley went to the burying. The boys did it themselves. I watched from the trees. They buried her on the hill overlooking the farm. They even carved a wooden marker, like she was a person, after all." Finch imagined the scene. The 3 giant, silent men, their faces unreadable, laying their broken mother to rest, the only person who had ever shown them a flicker of anything resembling love, even if it was a love crippled by fear. "And Jedediah?" he asked. "How long did he last?" "Another 2 years," Alara said. "He was in that cellar for 7 years in total. 7 years in the dark. The boys, they kept him alive. It wasn't about killing him. It was about possession. He was their penance. their justice. They unmade him piece by piece until the man he was gone, and only the animal was left. One day, the sound from the cellar just stopped. The finality of her words hung in the air. But it wasn't the end of the story. Finch knew there was one more act. The fire, he said. The farmhouse burned down. What happened? Alara pulled her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders, a chill that had nothing to do with the air settling over her. About a month after Jedediah went silent, the fire started. It was the middle of the night. The whole sky above the hollow turned orange. Everyone in the valley saw it. We all stood at our windows and watched the Gentry farm burn. We watched that curse get cleansed by flame. Was it an accident? Finch pressed. Alara gave a short, mirthless laugh. There are no accidents in these mountains, Doctor. The official story, the one Sheriff Coulter wrote in his report, was that a lantern must have overturned. Easy. Simple. No questions asked. The fire burned for 2 days. When it was done, there was nothing left but a stone chimney and a smoking hole in the ground. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. But I don't believe it was an accident. And I don't believe the boys were in it. After Sarah died, I saw them sometimes at the edge of the woods. They were looking out, not at the valley, but past it, towards the high ridges, towards the wilderness. They were never meant for this place. They were too big for it, their sorrow too large. They didn't belong in cages, and they didn't belong in houses. She paused, letting her theory settle. I think they finished their work. I think they took what was left of their father from that cellar, and they put him in the house. And then they set the fire, a funeral pyre, to burn away the sin, the house, the cage, all of it. And then they just walked away. They walked up into the mountains and never came back. It was a plausible, almost poetic ending. The monstrous sons, having enacted their terrible and meticulous revenge, simply returned to the wild, leaving a cleansing fire to erase the stage for their tragedy. But Finch, a man of logic, saw another possibility, a darker and more cynical one. Where the community did it, he said quietly. Hobbs, the sheriff. Once Jedediah was dead, the living evidence of his fate was a liability. The boys were a loose end. A fire. A fire is a very neat way to solve a problem you don't want to face. Alara considered this, her weathered face unreadable. Maybe, she conceded. Maybe they did. Maybe they decided the quarantine wasn't enough. Maybe they needed a true end. In a place like this, Doctor, the difference between a community protecting itself and a mob enacting its own justice is a very thin line. Does it matter who lit the match? The result is the same. The secret is ash. The story is a ghost story. Finch was left with 2 possible endings, both steeped in the moral ambiguity that defined Blackwood Creek. Had the sons, the victims turned avengers, completed their cycle of revenge and vanished into myth? Or had the community, in a final act of self-preservation, erased the last, inconvenient remnants of the Gentry affair? The truth was likely as lost as the triplets themselves. The mountains held their secrets. Alastair Finch remained in Blackwood Creek. He did not leave. The thought of returning to the structured, predictable world of Philadelphia now seemed impossible. He had looked into the abyss that lay beneath the placid surface of this isolated valley, and it had changed him. He was no longer just a man of science. He was the keeper of a dark history, the sole curator of the Gentry tragedy. His relationship with the town settled into a state of permanent, unspoken tension. The people still came to him for their ailments, their respect for his skill warring with their deep-seated fear of what he knew. They saw the knowledge in his eyes. He was a living reminder of the secret they had tried so hard to bury. Preacher Hobbs, and he never spoke again. They would pass on the town's single muddy street, and the preacher would stare straight ahead, his face a mask of iron piety, a man walking in a prison of his own making. Sheriff Coulter would offer a curt, uncomfortable nod, the gesture of a man ashamed. Finch had not exposed them, not in the legal sense. There is no court of law that could prosecute a crime of such labyrinthine moral complexity. What would be the charge? Unlawful imprisonment of a monster by his monstrous creations? Obstruction of a justice that no one wanted? The law had no language for what had happened at the Gentry farm. True justice had never been an option. There had only been a horrible, symmetrical revenge, followed by a conspiracy of silence, and finally, a cleansing by fire. Finch became a silent monument to that truth. He continued his work, healing the bodies of the people whose souls he knew were complicit in a great sin. He watched their children grow and wondered if the Gentry taint, the tendency to prefer a comfortable lie over a difficult truth, was passed down in the blood just as surely as the color of their eyes. Sometimes, in the quiet of the evening, he would take out Sarah Gentry's journal. He did not read it to uncover new facts, but as a kind of penance, a way of bearing witness. He read of her quiet suffering, of Jedediah's cold fanaticism, of the three giant boys whose capacity for love had been systematically starved and replaced with a patient, calculated rage. He thought of them often. The Gentry triplets, Cain, Abel, and Seth. Had they found some measure of peace in the vast, unpeopled wilderness of the Appalachians? Or were they doomed to carry their father's sins and their own through a life of lonely exile? Were they ghosts? Or were they simply men who had escaped a world that had no place for them? On a cold, late autumn afternoon, a year after his discovery, Finch walked the overgrown path to the Gentry ruins one last time. The fire had done its work. All that remained was the stone chimney, standing like a lonely tombstone against the gray sky, and a blackened, rectangular scar in the earth where the house had been. The cellar was a collapsed pit, the cage and its secrets now buried beneath tons of charred timber and rock. The earth had reclaimed its own. He walked to the hill where Alara had said Sarah was buried. He found the spot easily. A simple, weathered wooden cross stood there, gray and gnarled. At its base, there was something new, something that had not been there a year ago. It was a carving, a small wooden bird, almost identical to the one he had found in the house, but larger, its details more refined. It was carved from a piece of fresh pine, the wood still pale, the scent of resin faint on the air. Finch picked it up. It was heavy in his hand, solid. It was not the work of a ghost. It was the work of a living man. He looked up from the carving, his gaze sweeping across the vast, silent expanse of the mountains that rose up behind the farm. They were out there, the triplets, or at least one of them, Seth, the carver. They had come back, not for revenge, not for the valley, but for her, to leave a token at their mother's grave, a small act of remembrance, an acknowledgement of the one person in their blighted lives who had not seen them as monsters. It was the final, morally complex chord in a symphony of horror. It was not redemption. It was not forgiveness. It was simply an ending. Dr. Alastair Finch placed the carving back at the foot of the cross. He turned and walked away, leaving the ghosts to their rest. The story of the Gentry triplets would live on, but not as a simple tale of revenge. It would persist as a chilling testament to the cyclical nature of trauma, a grim reminder that the sins of the father are often paid for by the sons, and that in the deepest, darkest hollows of the human heart, the line between justice and vengeance is often erased completely, leaving only a terrible and unforgettable story.